Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today let's talk about poetry. So poetry is having a little bit of a modern resurgence. For the first time in a very long time, if not ever, poetry books are hitting the New York Times bestseller list. More and more people are interested in publishing poetry. Poets making use of social media are able to reach much larger audiences. So if you are a poet and interested in publishing your poetry, here is a breakdown of what that might look like. So there are four main routes to look at when publishing your poetry: magazines, small presses, large presses, and self-publishing. Let's start with magazines. Now, we do have a video on submitting short stories to literary magazines, and it's basically all the same with poetry. If you follow the guidelines in that video on short fiction and check individual magazines' requirements for poetry, you should be good. Just like when you're writing a short story collection, if you're writing a poetry collection, publishing the poems in magazines and journals is probably the place where you want to start. So no matter which publishing route you're taking for your entire book, this might be where you want to start to publish some of the individual poems. Publishing your poetry in journals gets your name out there, starts to build a name for yourself as a poet, and makes your poetry more marketable in the end. So the other three options are for publishing an entire book of poetry. So let's start with large presses. Even though the market for poetry is bigger than it has been in a very long time, there still isn't a huge market for poetry. Because of this, large presses probably won't look at unsolicited manuscripts and probably won't be interested in poets who haven't shown a large amount of success. If you have published poetry before and it's been successful, say in magazines or even in a self-published book, that shows there is an audience for your poetry. Or if you have a large social media presence based around your poetry, that is another way to prove that there is a market for your poetry. And really, that's what you need to show if you want to work with a large press, and that's that you have a large audience and you're able to reach them. Publishing poetry is even harder than publishing fiction because there's not as big of an audience, or at least it doesn't seem like there's as big of an audience. So you really have to show that you have an audience out there wanting to read your work. And just like with publishing fiction, you will probably need an agent if you're going to be working with a large press. However, there's another option that many poets go through, and that is the small press. Because of the reasons I just talked about, a lot of poets get started with smaller presses. Many small presses will read unsolicited manuscripts, meaning you don't need an agent. So you can skip the whole agenting stage and just query the presses directly. However, just like when querying an agent, make sure to always check the submission guidelines. Although many small presses will read unsolicited manuscripts, that doesn't mean all of them will. Another route is to go through contests. A lot of small presses will hold contests where the winner gets publication for their manuscript. Now with a contest, a reading fee somewhere between $10 to $30 is fairly normal. This is fairly standard across magazines, journals, and small presses for their contests, but if you're charged for anything else beyond that, it could be a scam. You should only pay the reading fee and nothing else. Now small presses don't have a ton of resources, but there's not a lot of money in poetry to begin with. So if you're in this to make money, poetry might not be the best form for you. But starting with a small press can be a great route to establish yourself as an author if you want to set your sights on working with a larger press in the future. Now for this reason, you may also want to start with a chapbook. That's a small leaflet type poetry book, often less than 40 pages. Here's an example of a chapbook right here. This is Teaching My Mother How to Give Birth by Worcestershire, and as you can see, it's very, very tiny. It's only 34 pages, it's super tiny, and there's not even enough room for the author's name or the book's title on the spine. Whereas an example of a full book of poetry would be something like Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong. As you can see, it's a little longer. This one clocks in at still only 90 pages. Poetry books are not that long, but that's kind of the difference between chapbook and poetry book. Now the thing about chapbooks is that they're very inexpensive to produce. In the past, it was actually quite common for authors to print and bind them themselves because it wasn't too difficult. You can Google how to make a chapbook, and there are relatively easy ways of doing so just by yourself without even using a print-on-demand service. Chapbook is a way of getting your poetry out there with very little investment. Even if you're working with a small press, a chapbook can be a way for both you and the press with very little monetary investment to get your poetry out there and try to find an audience for it in order to then publish a longer book of poetry. If your chapbook sells well, it can be a way for you to get your name out there and start paving the route to a full collection of poetry. Now, what can you expect if you're working with a small press? You probably won't be getting a large advance and potentially won't be getting any advance at all. Now, the press will arrange things like formatting and design as well as distribution, and they might help with some marketing, but really not that much. They can help you with some of the publicity, such as arranging a reading or a book launch, but ultimately most of the marketing is going to be in your hands since most small presses don't even have a marketing department. Now, a lot of small presses are university presses, so they run out of university, and these are often more well-funded than independent small presses, so they can also be a great place to look when you're sending out your manuscript. If you want some ideas of where to look if you want to publish with a small press, there's a list of reputable small presses linked in the description from Poets and Writers. Now that said, what about self-publishing? More and more poets are taking the DIY route, and in fact, like I mentioned before, there is a long tradition of poets self-publishing when poets would literally bind their own chapbooks. Now you can get your own chapbook printed through a print-on-demand service, and it's really quite easy. Basically, if you can handle design, formatting, and distribution, you're handling all of the responsibilities that a small press would normally do for you, which you're probably fairly capable of doing. Now, these are a couple things to keep in mind if you are self-publishing. Poetry books vary a lot in their trim sizes, much more so than fiction books. You find poetry books that are in some very, very strange trim sizes. Before you format your book and do all the design for your book, make sure the trim size you want to use is available from the print-on-demand service you plan on working with. Although poetry varies very widely in its trim sizes, print-on-demand services only have a limited selection of trim sizes. There are more and more print-on-demand services to choose from these days, and a lot of them have the benefit of offering hardcovers. However, with poetry, you rarely see hardcovers. Poetry usually is just printed in paperback from its release date, even when published through a press, just because it's so short, you know? You're not gonna see this 30-page book in a hardback. So that's one thing you don't really have to worry about. Amazon KDP doesn't offer hardback, and that's a drawback for a lot of novelists who want hardcovers. However, it won't really be an issue if you're writing poetry, unless you really have a vision for your hardcover poetry book, but that's just not really the norm when it comes to poetry. Whether you're self-publishing or publishing traditionally, marketing is going to be a huge thing for you as any writer, but specifically as a poet. So let's talk a little bit about marketing strategies for poetry. Now, the main one is social media. Over the past few years, there has been a huge establishment of different poets and different poetry communities across social media. Now, although a lot of poets who primarily build their platforms and find their audiences on social media sometimes get a rep as being specifically Instagram poets, which is kind of a new form of poetry that has emerged. Basically, no matter what form of poetry you write, social media can be used to your advantage. I see a lot of poets who wouldn't really be considered, you know, quote-unquote Instagram poets, using social media, connecting with their audiences through social media. No matter what form of poetry you write, social media is so valuable. Because poetry is so short, you can share entire works so easily through social media. What other form can you share the entire piece in a tweet or in one Instagram post? There really aren't that many. That's the advantage of poetry. It's kind of the ideal form for the digital age. And the community is thriving, so you might as well start getting involved now to connect with other poets as well as with future readers. As well, if you can, try to do readings locally. It is a great way to connect with other readers and writers locally and to hopefully sell some books in the process. If you live in a city with a fairly established cultural or literary scene, it probably won't be that difficult to get a reading arranged, since a lot of venues host readings relatively often if that kind of scene is established in your city. I live in a city that has a very well-established, long-standing literary circle, and there are poetry readings weekly. If you have a chance to do that, it's a great way to get your poetry out there, as well as to get some reading experience. Podcasts are another great avenue. Everybody has a podcast these days. Podcast is a great way to do a reading of your poetry that can reach more people than just the locals in your area, and can also help promote your work and get your name out there. So that is how to publish a poetry book. Thank you so much for watching. If you write poetry, let me know. Personally, I've been trying to learn how, but I'm really so new at it still that I don't know what I'm doing. But if you are a poet, I would love to hear about it. So thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe for new writing, editing, and publishing videos every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye.